doing today is I'm going to be summarizing Act 4 of Macbeth for you. But before we get to that, just also want to recap like the second half of Act 3 as well, just so that you guys have your minds refreshed in terms of where we are within the play, and so that we can enter Act 4 knowing exactly what's going on. Alright, so I'm going to start off at this scene here, which is at a banquet at Macbeth Castle. And this is just before, or should I say, this follows what happened just before, and that was when the murderers came to Macbeth and said, listen, we managed to kill Banquet, but Fleance, his son, escaped. And of course Macbeth gets really concerned and worried about that, and he starts stressing now that, you know, his position is still a threat because Fleance lives. And then luckily his wife comes over and says, listen, you need to get back to your guests because you're not being a very good host. So he recomposes himself, he returns to the feast, and then here, as you can see in this image, he does a toast to his friend Banquo, who is obviously not present because he's dead. After that, the nobleman says, you know, King, please come and have a seat. And as far as he's concerned, there is no available seat. So we can see in this picture here that the seat is clearly available. It's been booked for him. Everybody else can see that the seat is available. But he sees somebody sitting at that seat. And he doesn't know that it's Banquo at this stage. But once Banquo turns around, obviously, he sees that it is Banquo. And that really is, you know, the seeing of the ghost of Banquo is almost like when he sees the dagger. You know, he starts to feel the pressure of the acts he has performed. And the effects that they are having on his life at this point. So we see Macbeth alternating between times of great courage at this point, but also times of depression and uncertainty. You know, he's unsure of himself, he's losing his grip on reality. Of course, in 1971, they didn't have the greatest special effects and options available to them, so I reckon they just asked Banquo to put some talcum powder on. But I'm sorry for the gory picture, but that's what Banquo becomes again in the next scene when he sees him. And Macbeth obviously starts freaking out, and Lady Macbeth saves him, well, attempts to save him again. Remember, she pretended to faint that time after he had killed Duncan. And now she says to everybody, listen, please forgive him. He's been having these fits since childhood. It'll pass soon enough. Please don't pay any attention to him. It'll make him feel worse than he already does. Then in this scene here, you can see she pulls him aside and again threatens his manhood like she did before Duncan was killed. And she actually personifies shame. And she says, if shame were a being, it would be you. And Macbeth kind of gathers himself again because the ghost of Banquo disappears, but it's not long after that when the ghost reappears again, and he says, who of you have done this? And of course nobody can understand what he's talking about, and Lady Macbeth is really struggling to cover for him because he's not getting any better. And the whole ghost story is basically just his his subconscious, really, and the feelings of guilt that he has working on his mind that are creating these images. Macbeth goes on to say, while everybody's still there, he says to himself, because of course there's nobody there, but he says out loud, if you had taken any other form, no matter what it is, I wouldn't be afraid of you, but because you are this ghost, you terrify me. And then Lady Macbeth gets angry with him and says, you have displaced the mirth, you have ruined the joy. And Macbeth says, to everybody, how can you remain so calm? How can you not see this? Of course, nobody knows what he's talking about. Lady Macbeth realizes that, listen, she can't actually do any more. He's not getting any better. And she instructs everybody, I pray you, speak not. He grows worse and worse. Question enrages him. At once, good night. Stand not upon the order of your going, but go at once. So she basically tells everybody to just leave right now. And so they do leave. And of course they say, listen, we wish him everything of the best. Good night, says Lennox, and better health. Attend to his majesty. I hope he feels better. And after that point, Macbeth and his wife just remain behind, and he says, blood will have blood, which means that, listen, if we start killing, we have to keep on killing. That's just how it goes. And Macbeth is also a little bit annoyed that Macduff wasn't at his dinner, And then he says to his wife, I'm going to go and see the weird sisters tomorrow. More shall they speak. In other words, he wants to know his future. And, it's interesting because here we can see in the start of Act 4 where he's on his way to the witches. And, he thinks that he has the witches under his control. He thinks that he can go and visit them at any time and they will give him information. And they do respond. They do that. But in actual fact, it's really the witches that have Macbeth under their spell, if you pardon the wording there. Maybe I shouldn't use under his spell, but you understand what I'm saying, wrapped around their finger in a sense, because they know that Macbeth has this vaulting ambition. They know that he's going to do everything that they ask, and everything that, he's going to act on what they tell him, even if it is equivocation, even if it's not the full truth. He will still take that to heart. He's not going to just flog them off as some supernatural being. It doesn't make sense, or whatever the case is. Okay, so really they can say whatever they want to say. But just before this scene, I'm just jumping the gun a little bit. I just didn't have a picture there, so it made me forget. Scene 5 of Act 3, which is after this scene, and it's not shown in the movie. We see Hecate, who's the head witch, and she meets with the other witches, and she says, listen, she's actually really annoyed that the witches were involving themselves in the life of Macbeth without first actually consulting her. She says she could have done a better job. And also she reminds them that Macbeth is devoted to himself. He's very self-centered. He's not devoted to them. But she says, okay, fine, I'll clean up your mess. She tells the witches to meet her in the morning when Macbeth will come to know his destiny. So obviously she has the power to see within the future and knows that Macbeth will be coming to visit. And there's also a little song there which critics believe is not actually Shakespeare's work. It was added sometime between 1606 1623, and considering Shakespeare died in 1616, would indicate that he didn't write that. They say that it was probably the playwright Thomas Middleton, but that's just a little bit of extra information. You don't really need to know that. I just thought it was quite interesting. And then of course all the witches leave, and then scene 6 of Act 3, there's a little castle somewhere in Scotland, and we have Lennox and the Lord sitting there. And Lennox says, isn't it weird that Duncan was murdered and then his sons were blamed, and then Banquet was murdered and his son is being blamed, and his son has disappeared, and Duncan's sons ran away, and it's almost as if at the same time Macbeth grieved both those murders, but he didn't really lose anything because of them. He then actually says his presence at the tyrant's feast, and by calling it the tyrant's feast, he's referring to Macbeth as a tyrant, a cruel ruler. So he says that Macduff now lives in disgrace. Why? Because he says that Macduff believes that Macbeth actually killed Duncan. So Macduff really is onto Macbeth at this point. And a lot of the noblemen at that time in Scotland also knew that Macbeth was a terrible ruler, and they actually didn't want to follow him, but they were bound to, obviously, because he was king. And then the Lord says that, listen, Macduff has actually joined Malcolm in England. This Lord doesn't have a name, he's just referred to as Lord. And then he says that apparently Malcolm and Macduff, he believes, are convincing the very religious King Edward, who's the King of England, and the other English nobles there to help them fight against Macbeth. So in other words, get an army together and go and fight. This scene, not very flattering for these poor ladies. It must be terrible to be cast in a movie based on your looks, and that we need you to look ugly. That's quite savage. But anyway, so this is Act 4, Scene 1, and you can see there the cauldron. They're making spells. They're putting in all these ugly ingredients, which you can see over there, such as toe of frog, eye of newt, snake, wool of bat, and tongue of dog, etc. Those are all very ugly things, evil things, which obviously hints towards the evil occurrences that are going to be happening in the future for Macbeth, which is also not very pleasant. And then going back to this image here, this is where one of the witches says, something wicked this way comes, and then they all laugh. And the reason for that is they themselves are evil, but now they can even recognize Macbeth as somebody who is really wicked and evil as well. So it's almost funny how you know, if you're the witch now, you who are, you know, the epitome of evil, really, actually calling somebody else just as evil as you are coming. Okay, so that's what that is all about. And then this is Macbeth being forced to look, obviously, at the first apparition, and what he sees is, and it's very important that you know exactly what these apparitions are. So the first apparition is an arm and head like Macbeth's, which rises from the cauldron. Of course, in the movie, it doesn't actually rise. It's like within the funny liquid stuff, the potion that they've made up. But the first apparition says, "You must beware Macduff." Right, so then he says, "I want you to speak more," and of course he says, you know, "It will not be commanded." But here's another apparition, and the second apparition is a bloody child, and it says, "Macbeth, Macbeth, Macbeth, be bloody, bold, and resolute, laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." So at this point, Macbeth thinks, okay, the first apparition said, "Beware Macduff," but the second apparition says, "Nobody who's born from a woman can hurt me." So now he's thinking, well, then in that case, why should I be concerned about Macduff? You know, Macduff can live for all I care. And then he changes his mind and says, you know what, maybe I should actually just kill Macduff anyway, just to be sure. And then that takes us to the third apparition. So he's obviously got quite a bit of confidence at this point, but the third apparition says, "Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam wood to high Dunsinane hill shall come against him." And this is coming from a child crowned with a tree in his hand. And I've put that image over here because that is actually what it is. But in the film, they used these two guys to portray that message. I'm not quite sure why they did that. But what the meaning is that you will never be destroyed or killed until Great Birnam Wood, which is a forest which lies at the base of the mountain on which Dunsinane Hill, which is Dunsinane Hill, so at the base of that hill, on top of the hill is Macbeth's castle. So until that forest walks to the hill, you will be safe. And so Macbeth gets all really confident now, and he says, well, that's impossible. That can't happen. Trees can't walk. They can't uproot themselves. And then he says, "Yet my heart throbs to know one thing. Tell me, if you art can tell so much, shall Banquo's issue ever reign in this kingdom?" In other words, will Banquo's children ever rule the kingdom? So that's really the last thing that he needs to know. If he gets an answer of that, and they say no, then he'll feel like really confident. He'll feel like he's at peace. Okay. But the witches say, "Ask no more questions." So Macbeth demands it. He says, "I will be satisfied. Answer me, deny me this, and an eternal curse fall on you." I think it's quite ironic how he threatens to curse them, when in actual fact, I think we can all agree that the only person who's really been cursed here is Macbeth himself. But the witches say, "Show, show, show," and what we see is a show of 8 kings who pass one by one across the stage as Macbeth speaks, the last with a mirror in his hand, and Banquo's ghost follows. So although it's not portrayed that well in the movie, the idea is that the kings appear to go on for eternity, and this represents Banquo's descendants, Banquo's children. And one of the kings in the mirror is holding 2 orbs, which are like little round balls with a cross on it. And after that, once all the apparitions and that have happened, the witches kind of tease Macbeth for looking so terrible when he saw his future destruction. They do a little dance again, and then they vanish. Macbeth then returns to his castle, and Lennox is there, and Lennox actually tells him, "Listen, Macduff has indeed gone to England to join Malcolm, and they're planning an army against you to overthrow you." And Macbeth has a little soliloquy and an aside, and he says how, from now on he's not going to act immediately on whatever thought enters his mind. He's not going to contemplate the pros and the cons. He's just going to make a decision and go for it as soon as he thinks about it. And he says he's going to start off with wiping out Macduff's entire family, and that's just out of hatred for Macduff and the fact that he's betrayed him now, and he's a traitor essentially to him. He's left the country, and now he's going to plot against him. So he says, "Okay, fine, I'll kill your whole family." So then that takes us to scene 2 of Act 4, where we're at Macduff's castle at Fife. That's Fife in Scotland. And the Thane of Ross, just referred to as Ross, enters in and tells Macduff, listen, this is what has happened. Your husband has gone to England. And she's angry. She says, why has my husband left me? He clearly doesn't love me, because she uses this idea of, you can picture a wren as a bird, quite a small bird. Even though it has to fight against an owl, maybe, it will protect its nest as long as it possible. In other words, it will protect it until it dies, even though that bird knows it's not going to win. And she's saying, well, the only reason why her husband could have possibly left is because he's terrified. He's afraid. Scotland's a very bad place. Maybe he's scared he's going to get killed as well. And he's left his wife and his children, essentially the nest, in other words, their house or their castle, alone without any defense. So she reckons that he just doesn't love them. And the Thane of Ross says, no, listen, you need to really pull yourself together, because your husband is a noble, wise, judicious man. He's obviously doing this for a reason. And then he explains that, when things get really, really bad, they can only get better from then on. And your husband is obviously doing something to try and make life better. And Lady Macduff, says, well, my son is fathered, yet he is fatherless. In other words, he has a father, but he no longer actually has a father. And then so Ross leaves, and we have a scene here where Lady Macduff is busy bathing her son. Now, it only in the play refers to son. There's no other children, but we discover later on, or we read later on, that all his children were killed. So there was clearly more than one child, even though in this scene we only see a son. And there's an exchange between the mother and the son here, where Lady Macduff says, what are you going to do without a father? And the son kind of cheekily replies, well, what are you going to do without a husband? And she says, well, I can get 20 husbands at any point, at any time at the market. And the son says, yeah, you'll sell them probably. And she says, you talk like a child, but you're actually pretty smart. And then the son asks, was my father a traitor? And his mother says, yes. And the reason why she says that is because he's a traitor in that he's left his wife and his children all alone, defenseless. All right. And then the son says, well, what is a traitor? And she says, well, one that swears and lies. And the son says, and are all traitors? Do they all do that? Do they all swear and lie? And Lady Macduff savagely says, well, everyone that does so is a traitor and must be hanged. And then that conversation goes on a little bit. Not too worried about that. But then what is important is that a messenger arrives. We don't know who this messenger is. It's just referred to as messenger. And we don't know how he knows this information. But he says to her, listen, I know you don't know who I am, but trust me on this one. You take yourself and your children and leave now. Just leave. And Lady Macduff said, well, why should I leave? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not going anywhere. And lo and behold, some murderers arrive. Now, these are the murderers that Macbeth has obviously arranged or hired to go and kill Lady Macduff and Macduff's children. And in quite a well-known line, the son calls the one murderer a shaghead villain, and the murderer stabs him and says, what, you egg? After, or should I say before, putting a knife in him. And then the son goes over to the mother and says, mother, he has killed me. Run away, I pray you. And then the son dies. And though it's not written in the play, at this point in any case, we do discover that Lady Macduff is killed, which we hear later on in scene 3. Now, if we jump to scene 3, we go to England, and this is a scene outside King Edward's castle. And really what is happening here is that Malcolm decides that he now must test Macduff to see if he's actually loyal, because Malcolm's afraid that Macbeth has sent Macduff to try and lure Malcolm back into like a kind of trap, and then he'll be killed. So the way Malcolm tests to see if Macduff is genuine is he says, you do realize that if I become king, I'm going to be a terrible king. Like, I will be worse than Macbeth. And Macduff gets really upset about this, and he tries to say, no, that's not true or whatever. But basically, at the end of the day, Malcolm eventually trusts Macduff because he realizes that Macduff is really patriotic. He really does care about Scotland, and he would hate for Malcolm, who was a terrible king, to be king. You know, Macduff is like, oh, we're all doomed and all that. So eventually, he accepts it, and then Ross can't hold this information back anymore because he knows that the fate of Macduff's family. And so Macduff says, please, you got to tell me. And so he says, listen, I don't know how he knows, but he just knows. And he says, listen, unfortunately, your wife and your children were killed. And this makes Macduff really, really angry. And Malcolm says, listen, don't go and cry now about it. Turn that sadness into anger and go back and kill Macbeth. And what is quite logical and realistic in a sense is that Macduff says, yes, I will do that, but I also need to grieve as a man as well. So he has a moment where he's on his knees and he's crying, and he says, listen, the worst thing is that my wife and my children were killed not because of their sins, not because what they had done, it's because what I have done. So he feels like really responsible for their deaths because, he's the one who's betrayed Macbeth, who's gone to England and who's plotting against him and that. So he feels like he's responsible. But at the end of the act, he makes a decision that he is in fact going to get an army together, and he's going to turn that grief into anger, and he's going to unleash that anger upon Macbeth.